Welcome to the Impactus podcast, episode number 8. I'm Kirk Giles, joined by Mauricio Rosa, and today, Dwayne Klein. Our Impactus podcast is here to equip you as men for a life of purpose and godly impact. And those of you who aren't familiar with Dwayne, he is the pastor of what used to be Houston Street Baptist Church, and just went through just like Promise Keeper Canada and Impactus, you just went through a whole name change, except you did it more than just a name change. You built the building you've talked about for years, and you guys are moved in. Great things happening for you guys. So maybe just for some of our guys who are familiar with your story, Dwayne, give a quick update on where the church is at and the new name and just how things are going for you guys in ministry.
Yeah, so our church has been in one of Canada's poorest communities for 132 years. I've had the privilege of being here for 26 years, and we just finished a new facility that gives us 32,000 square feet of worship space and ministry space, and then 32,000 square feet of housing. And so there's 45 apartments in the building where we're able to house people that need affordable and supportive housing. It's permanent housing. It's not a temporary housing situation, but for people in poverty looking for supports. We're working with another organization, Indwell, that's partnered with us in that. And so everybody's moved in. We're in the facility, and it's amazing. It's one of the most environmentally friendly buildings in all of North America. And it's also got one of the best ventilation systems in North America, which we didn't know how handy that would be in COVID. And so it's been a real blessing, and we're thankful to God for that.
That's awesome. And Mauricio, it is good to see you. This is the first time that we've connected since I've officially finished my role as president of the ministry. I'm glad to see that you haven't been snowed under in Calgary or anything like that.
Not yet. Yeah, no, it's very good to see you, Kirk. It's really a real pleasure to be here with both of you guys and to talk about what we're going to talk today, and even to look back and and see how much has changed in such a short time. So it's good. It's real joy, real pleasure to join you guys and to hear all the news that Dwayne is talking about this building. For me as an architect background, to hear all that about, the building, how technology can make people's life better is exciting to me. So.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I know that building has been a real answer to prayer for many years. And if you've been to any of our conferences over the last few years and heard Dwayne speak, you've heard him talk about this dream and vision that God had given to them as a church. So it's really exciting to see it coming and being a reality for them, especially in 2020 and the challenges of 2020. Today in the podcast, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do our annual kind of year in review, look ahead to the new year, and just talk about just some of the challenges and some of the realities men have dealt with, but not just the challenges, but some of the ways we've seen God at work in men's lives as well. And some of the ways that we can be inspired as men and encouraged as we move into 2021. I think it's safe to say 2020 has kind of thrown a monkey wrench in just about everybody's life in some way, shape, or form. But God has still been on the move and working, and men have been active in serving God. So there's lots to look back on and reflect on in this past year. But before we do that, I want to actually take us back to before COVID, BC. And so we're going to go to 2019 BC, and we're going to just think back to where the three of us were a year ago at this time, as we're approaching the end of 2019. And what were you thinking about as you were approaching the end of 2019? What was on your heart, your mind, as you thought about what you were hoping for 2020? And just reflect a little bit on 12 months ago where you were at this point. So Dwayne, let's start with you on that.
Well, we were finishing this building project that's been in the work for years. People have written about it from all across Canada. And so in July, we were awarded by a non-Christian architectural magazine as one of the lead designs in all of Canada with this building, which is environmentalist. And we wanted to have a big splash. Like, we were planning parties and donor thank yous, and we were planning welcome and how to invite the community in. And we were planning all of that. Like, all kinds of politicians and dignitaries wanted to come. news crews, and some of them still came. You might have seen us in the papers, on the news, but and some politicians came, but all socially distant. So there were no big parties, there was no big splash, there was no how do we welcome in the community. I mean, this new facility holds 500 on a Sunday morning, and our old facility held 140, and we were renting the school. We were so excited. We were looking forward to packing it out and using an overflow and seeing what God would do, and all of that was gone, completely gone.
Mauricio,
We started the bang, eh?
That's right. The bang was COVID.
Mauricio, what about you going back a year ago?
Well, in all honesty, a year back from now, I was actually counting the days to go to Brazil for holidays to see my family. So, looking forward to getting away from the cold in Calgary, looking forward, going to the pool and, sipping peanut coladas and all that. So a year ago, that's where my mind literally was. But also, like, as a ministry, we were, talking and discussing about, Promise Keepers Impactus and the whole ministry to guys online. So that's where kind of my mind and my heart were as well. And then eventually the transition, the idea of transitioning to a content manager role that was supposed to actually, this whole transition online was supposed to take, I don't know, at least several months, not couple weeks. So COVID kind of accelerated things just a tiny bit. So that was interesting.
It's so true. I remember that. I remember when you were going to Brazil, and I remember right around this time for me, so my wife had just had a serious case of vertigo, really bad, and it was so bad she laid on our bathroom floor and slept on our bathroom floor for a full day. She couldn't move. And we look back on it now, and it's a funny story now because she's feeling much better. But on that day, I finally was like, you need to somehow get into bed. Like, you can't sleep on a bathroom floor all night as well as all day. And so I had a blanket underneath of her, and I literally dragged my wife, Shannon, across the floor on this blanket and dragged her into our bedroom so that I could pick her up and put her into our bed. And at the time, she probably wasn't so happy with me for dragging her on the floor. But we look back now and it's funny. We didn't know it at the time, but we were also about less than 2 weeks away from my mother-in-law passing away. My mother-in-law had cancer, and she ended up passing away on Christmas Eve last year. So when we got to the end of 2019, my whole mindset was 2020 cannot possibly be any more chaotic or worse than 2019 was. I came into 2020 thinking this year is going to be so much better than 2019. And then, everything that has happened in 2020. So it was a crazy, crazy season in our life that I'm glad I can look back on and smile about now, but I wasn't so much smiling about it at the time. So when we think back to 2020, and we know all the stories about COVID and how COVID has impacted, churches and families and day-to-day life and everything else. And I don't think we need to spend a lot of time reflecting on that. But where have you guys seen men struggle in 2020? When you just think back to the last year, what are some of the things that jump out at you in terms of how men have struggled? Mauricio, let's start with you.
Well, Kirk, I think this is a very good question, because I think what COVID has done to us, and there's one way that we can look at that. I believe that every challenge or every difficulty is God's opportunity to expose the things that are really in our hearts sometimes. And I think one thing that COVID did was to expose challenges that men have been facing even before COVID. And I think one particular one that for me and dealing with guys and that I see that affect them deeply was men is struggling, one, with their identity as a man, as a provider, by losing jobs. Like here in Alberta, people are hurting. People are, like, suicide rates are high. People are really struggling with jobs, and this whole identity that is tied into their job and their provision to their families. So I think COVID, what it did, it really kind of brought forth this reality that a lot of guys are struggling. And in kind of together with that is also the reality that for me right now, even as it is right now, as we are doing a stress and anxiety and depression online small group, how much men are really, really hurting when it comes to mental health. And that is not just them being sissies, you know, like this is a real issue. This is a real problem that we ought to talk more, that we ought to, you know, to really engage in and see guys are truly hurting.
I appreciate you saying, excuse me, saying that, Mauricio, because I think that we've come a long way in men being willing to talk about that stuff. And that's encouraging to me that guys are more and more guys are prepared to talk about some of their mental health challenges. And I know we'll talk more about where we've seen men thriving in 2020, but I just want to say to guys who maybe are still living in that place of shame of talking about their mental health challenges, depression, whatever it is they're facing, to be encouraged by the fact that other men around you are stepping into the light on that stuff and bringing it out of that place of shame or secret, because it loses some of its edge in our lives when we can bring it out into the light, bring it out into the open. And so, yeah, as much as it's real for guys, it's also good that guys are stepping into the conversations more and more. And it's acceptable in our society for men to step into those conversations more and more as well. Dwayne, what about you? What are some of the things that you've seen men struggling with in 2020?
Yeah, well, I mean, I concur with Mauricio. Like, the mental health has been a big one. Anxiety, depression, they're on the increase, as well as the identity crisis, because so much of our identity is wrapped up in job. But there's other things. Leading well in COVID is hard. Every day you're looking for new protocols, new rules, new guidelines, and it's happening all across the country. And so how do you lead your family in that? If you're leading a business, how do you lead your business in that? How do you lead your church in that? For those that are leading the church, when next week you may not be able to meet, and the week after you can gather at a certain size number, or your protocols at work have changed. How do you run a business? What do you do when you can't make payroll? I mean, there's a lot of stress that's been involved in men's lives this year, and leading well has been an incredible challenge. But a couple of others, fellowshipping well. Men aren't typically good at fellowshipping community. And this has exasperated that problem. It's really identified how hard it is. And so for many, they have really been isolated, and they've been isolated at home. And when men are doers and there's nothing to do, and you're now at home, and you know you should have a better relationship with your wife, and you know that you should be spending more time with your kids, and you know you should be engaging in that. I mean, when you read, whether it's Apple TV, Netflix, Disney, when you read the increased watchability this year of shows and TV, I mean, people have just drowned themselves in that because they don't know how to engage with each other. And I'm going to add one more thing. I think a big complicating factor that a lot of men have faced is either then they're asking, so where's God in all this?
Right.
Like, where's God in this suffering? Where's God when my uncle passes away and we can't gather for his funeral? Where's God when my mother is dying with COVID in the hospital? Where's God when this is happening? And their neighbors are asking that, where's your God right now? And they don't know how to answer that. And it's also created for some a faith crisis. I've talked to a number of colleagues of mine, not just pastors, but leaders of ministries, who are experiencing a crisis of faith. And if that's happening to them, I know what's happening all across the church.
Yeah, no kidding. It's almost unsettling on so many levels to think that our faith leaders would be having a crisis of faith in these kinds of moments that we've experienced. Just coming back to what you're saying about the men being isolated relationally and being bored at home at different times. In addition to the increase on Netflix and everything else, so the increase on porn use in this year has been intense. And so it circles back to what Mauricio said earlier, and that it just exposed a lot of things that were in our hearts already. So if your marriage wasn't good and you don't know how to connect relationally well with your spouse, and suddenly the thing that takes up most of your energy and time is taken away from you, your job,
And your hobbies are gone. There's no hockey.
and your hobbies are gone, there's no hockey or anything like that, and you're sitting at home and you're bored, you're afraid to enter into the relationship because you know it's not good and you don't know what to do. And so you start looking for the escape routes and something to fill that emptiness inside of us. And whether that was Netflix or more television or more gaming on the internet, or whether it was porn, we just saw guys finding different escape routes throughout the year. It's interesting. One of the things that I put down, and it kind of ties together with all of this, is I really sensed an anger in a lot of men as they recognized how out of control they were. As you know, especially back in the spring when things were starting to kind of unravel all around us, men knew immediately, I am out of control. I can do nothing right now about any of this stuff. And the anger that started to bubble up and come out in different environments was intense from a lot of guys, and it was crazy. Another thing that helped me in the first half of the year especially was I struggled with some of that sense of being out of control too. And I was in the process of transitioning out of Promise Keepers, came out on Impactus and going to serve in the church, but that was put on hold because of COVID. And I just felt like I was in this place of, I am really out of control. And what do I do? And through my devotions, God gave me a whole new appreciation for his sovereignty. And I didn't know this, but God was actually preparing me for this before COVID even hit. One of the things I do at the end of every year is I ask God just to give me a Bible verse or two to meditate on as my verse for a year. And I did this back in December last year. And today I went back to look at the verse that God gave me for 2020. So you guys will appreciate this as I read this verse. Listen, Isaiah 40, beginning at verse 17. All the nations are as nothing before him. Just stop and think about everything that's happened in the nations of the world in 2020. Yeah. Right? And it says, all the nations are as nothing before him. They are considered by him as empty nothingness.
Right.
Which is,
wow.
It's crazy. And then verse 18, with whom will you compare God? What likeness will you set up for comparison with him? And, I did not know that I needed those verses last December. But God gave those two verses to me as my kind of personal verses for 2020. And then through my devotions in the spring and things like that, he really brought me to a new level of appreciating and resting in his sovereignty. That his sovereignty was not something to be overwhelmed by or afraid of or threatened by in any way, shape, or form, but is actually a place to rest as a person. And so to actually be able to be okay with saying, I'm not in control, and that's okay. It's such a relief and release to be able to live in that kind of space. So we
need to do that to rely on him, because he's got, the power, the grace, the strength, the might we need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that, as I've listened to you guys, there's kind of this synergy. All of these things are kind of interconnected with each other, and they are kind of rooted in this space of our faith in God and who God is to us. And even Dwayne, your comment about guys who are having that crisis of faith in these moments, it really forces us to ask the question, doesn't it? Like, what kind of God do I expect God to be?
Well,
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Mel.
sorry, Kirk, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was even, yeah, I was thinking on that, like the comment that Dwayne, that you brought up about the lack of, the doubt and faith and all this. I think it also revealed within the Christian community, in particular, because all that we were talking about, the crisis that we are talking about in marriages and identity and porn and all that, this is not something exclusive of non-Christians. This is going within the Christian community, which I think it reveals to us that sometimes how our faith can be detached from reality. In other words, like, what are the implications? If you really believe that God is sovereign, it has to have implications in your everyday life. And are we prepared to make this connection? Are we prepared to link this to our life? And in all honesty, I find sometimes that a lot of the men, they just don't know. They just don't know how to make this bridge. They just don't know. Like, I was just reading some articles on CBC talking about how divorce became, exacerbated through the pandemic. And in all honesty, I think a lot of guys don't know how to do it. They don't know how to deal with that because they don't know how to actually take the concepts of their Christian faith and bring that to their everyday life in a way that it actually changes, their everyday.
That's a great point, Mauricio. So I'm going to put Dwayne on the spot here. You're a pastor, Dwayne, and I'm sure you've experienced...
As if you were not a pastor, Kirk.
You've experienced these kinds of conversations, I'm sure, many times over with people who are, intellectually, they go, I know the Bible says God is sovereign.
Right.
And then things happen in their life and they go, I don't know how to actually live like I believe that God is sovereign. And so how would you, so if someone's listening to the podcast today and Mauricio's just kind of hit on a point for them where they go, yeah, I know God's sovereign. I know all that already, but I'm really having a hard time making that connection into my real everyday life. What kind of advice would you give them to help them make it real for them?
I mean, two things come to mind. The one is this, is advice I give to every young believer when they've come to faith in Christ is mark down the moments in your life where you see God move, where you see God work, where you see God answer prayer. In the Old Testament, they would set these altars that would be, markers saying God met us here. Yeah. And I say to them, do that because there'll be a season in your life where you're going to start to doubt it. There's going to be a season where the prayers haven't been answered the way you thought they would be, where times have been dark. And in those seasons, you want to remember the times, no, I know God is real. I know he's in my life. I know he's worked because these things are true. Obviously, I also believe that needs to be grounded in Scripture. And so a healthy diet of Scripture, whether that's reading every day, coming to Impactus or Promise Keepers, listening to their podcast every day, where you get a really healthy dose of Scripture, or having the Bible read to you, because you can have different apps that allow you to do that if you struggle with reading. And I'm going to give a third thing is, in COVID, we at our church at James North Baptist, we've rediscovered lament. Mm-hmm. And lament has been a beautiful gift of God, mm-hmm. where we can take the pain we're experiencing, cry out to God, trusting in his promise. Lament is coming to God. And when many of my guys are like, what do I do when I've lost my business? What do I do when my daughter's struggling right now? What do I do when I can't figure out online school? I've said, cry out to God in your pain. It's okay, just go, like in our honesty, God. And he hears that. And we say, but God, I trust you. In my pain, I trust you. I've had relatives die in COVID, some with COVID, some with cancer, where some believers, some unbelievers, and I would always be taking these family funerals. And there's been none. And so I've grieved, and our families grieved. Like, we can't even gather for these things. Yeah. And where the world complains, the Christian laments. And to teach our men how to lament, so many of our men have really appreciated that as a gift. And about a year ago, Mark Vroegop wrote a book, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. And that has been a really helpful book for many in understanding lament and how to come before God and just cry out in pain, and then allow the Spirit of God to really be the one that refreshes you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that book has helped me personally in 2020, has had a great impact in my life. And I know we did episode 6, I believe, was with Mark Vrogop talking about the whole gift of lament. So if you're listening to Dwayne talk about lament and you're like, what is he talking about?
Right.
Go back to episode 6 of the podcast, listen to the interview we did with Mark Vrogop, and get a hold of the book, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. Great tool, great resource to help you out with processing lament. Okay. That's all the bad stuff of 2020. It's time to move on from the bad stuff because one of the things that often happens in men's ministry world is we like to kind of pile on and say, these are all the places where men have screwed up and have made a mess out of things. But it's not all bad news. It's not all terrible. Men have in different ways been thriving in 2020 and some great things have happened. So what are some of the things you've observed in men's lives in the past year where you've seen men thriving? Dwayne, let's start with you on that one.
Yeah, we've been blessed. I've watched men rise to the occasion. Men who've been disengaged from their family come to me or other staff at our church and say, how do I engage my family again? How do we have family night again? What does it look like to really care for my wife? How do I date her in COVID? How do I come alongside of my kids? And we've had some families that were fragile thrive in COVID and really come back to life again, start family devotions again. We've walked with men who've like, man, I don't even know how to figure out online church. How do I do it? And they've really risen to the occasion to figure out online church. Now, it's interesting. Some Sundays for us, we always did a pre-service. And one week we said, take pictures of how your family is worshiping this Sunday. We'll show them next Sunday. People were in bed. People were on the couch with their kids in their pajamas. People were eating breakfast. We were like, hey, these are men calling their families to worship. They're doing it. It all looks a little different. Some were dressed for church. And other things, we found people have just found really creative ways to connect. Like in our community, so many of our men just rose to the occasion and said, we're going to move our small group ministry online. And they did it seamlessly, and they did it well. And people that had checked out of it checked back in. And men who came to the occasion said, how do we care for people that are isolated? What can we do? And so people did sidewalk drops or sidewalk visits. They would create all kinds of ways to make sure that people that weren't feeling included were included. And we watched men in our church on a number of occasions just rise to the occasion to care for their families, care for others, and care for people that were lonely and isolated.
Yeah, that's amazing. Mauricio, how about you? What are some of the places you've seen men thrive?
Well, I think for me, I think the biggest one for me, actually, it happened not that long ago in particular. I think there is this guy who is a volunteer facilitator for our online small groups. The week that he was going to start his small group, he lost his job. And he said, no, I think God actually, he's taking care of me. Now he gave me even more time to invest in this man, in this group that God entrusted me. And I didn't have to kind of cue him in to say any of those things or to prompt him to say any of those things. But you can see that genuinely God was working in his life for him to have a different perspective. And I think to me, it kind of goes back to the first point, like, when I think about how men are thriving these days, I think about, the story of Elijah when he's thinking that he's left alone. There is no more prophets. He's the one and left alone. And God comes to him and said, no, I have saved this many thousand prophets. They're still serving me. They're still worshiping me. And I think it is important for us to remember, there are these guys that God is working and they are doing all these things, like standing up to serve others or understanding the presence of God through all the circumstances. I think to me, this example of this guy, and it was a beautiful example.
That's so cool. And I've seen so many stories as well in 2020 of men just thriving. For every guy who has struggled with connecting with his family, I can probably tell 5 stories of guys who have stepped up and connected better with their families during COVID. I've seen men who have created, like I had one guy come up to me and he had the biggest smile on his face and he goes, I have never spent so much time playing with my kids as I have in the last couple of months. And I go, That's amazing. Like, he's just so excited about the time he's having hanging out with his kids. I seen just God work in powerful ways in men's lives. I had a man come up to me a couple of weeks ago, tears in his eyes after a church service, and just talking about the things God's been doing in his life and in his family over these last number of months. I think about a man I know who thought his family was getting too comfortable sitting at home watching church online, and to the point where he just said, you know what, we're not taking this seriously anymore. And he looked at his family and he said, next Sunday, we're going to church. We're not going to sit at home because we're not taking worshiping God seriously when we just sit in our living room and watch it. And I just think, man, those are just so many cool stories of God using men to step in and to lead well and to love their family and others around them well. And so I just want to encourage, there are so many faithful men in listening ear of this podcast. I just want to encourage you to keep going, keep being strong in the Lord and letting God shape your life. God has used you in greater ways than you realize that he's used you in a time of complete chaos in the world around us. And so keep going strong, man. We love you and appreciate you, which kind of leads to our final question for our discussion today. And that is, as we look into next year, into 2021, what are some things that you think men can do to just leave and to live and lead well in 2021? What does that look like practically? Marcia, go ahead, Marcia. Let's start here.
Well, the first thing that I think about, Kirk, is this. I think we all know this, but I think right now it really demands us to be really more intentional about it. And the thing that I'm saying is this: if you want to lead your family well through this crisis or any challenge in your family, is point them to God and to his faithful character. I think if there, as Wayne was saying before, we in moments of this, we have to remember who God is, everything he has shown to you before, and we have to keep pointing to them all the time. For example, one thing that I love about Calgary here is the sky. The sky in Calgary in the fall, in the winter, it's the most beautiful thing for me. And so when I'm driving my son to school every morning and I see this beautiful reddish kind of a sky, I tell my son, I say, Thomas, look how beautiful this sky is, how creative, how awesome God is. And God has not given up on us. The sun is shining, and we need to point our families, our kids, our wives to see God. And as we see his greatness, I think that becomes the starting point for everything else that will fall in place in a practical way to lead our families through these seasons.
That's good. Dwayne?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few thoughts come to mind, but I think, what are some lessons that we've learned through COVID that we want the Lord just to really impress upon us? What are some of the rhythms or patterns that we established that we're thankful for? Maybe it's been more time with the family. Maybe more men barbecued this summer than ever before, to think, I don't want to lose sight of that. I don't want to not do that again. There's things that I miss that I look forward to. But men are builders, and we're about to have the opportunity to rebuild like never before. There's been more bankruptcies than there's ever been. More churches have struggled than have ever struggled. More parachurches are disappearing off the face of the Canadian landscape than ever before. They're suggesting that tens of millions of people across our world are entering into extreme poverty every month right now, every month. And so we have the chance to rebuild coming out of this. And men are builders, to dream, to vision, to say to God, God, what do you want to do? And it might be what he wants you to do at work when you move from a home office back to an office. It may be what he wants you to do in your neighborhood. It might be what he wants you to do in your family. And it might be bigger than that. And all those things are critical, but it might be in your city or in our country, and to rebuild.
Yeah, that's really good. I think a few things that come to my mind when I think about 2021. I think take care of your health. Don't get so busy rebuilding that you don't take care of your health along the way, because the temptation is going to be, we've got a ton of work to do. Let's jump in and do all the work that we got to get done. So remember the lessons you learned from this past year about taking care of your mental health, taking care of your physical health, taking care of your spiritual health. Take care of your health as you go into 2021. I think really just building with what you guys have said, let's connect those dots and say, okay, if God's led you to already start leading your family and investing in your family in different ways, now start to think about how you can help in leading your family, that as a family, you're reaching out to the people around you. Whether it's your neighbors, the people in your community, or globally, wherever God may want you to reach out. But don't think of this as just a exercise for yourself, but it's a, how do I bring my family along for the ride? And together, we're going to reach people around us who need help, who need Jesus, and make it a family mission. So take the equity you've built over this past year, investing in your family, and now take it to another level of helping your family to understand what it looks like to live for Jesus in the everyday moments of life and reaching out to the people around you. And so those would be a couple things that I would just really encourage men as we go into 2021. Well, there is so much more that we could talk about, but we are really out of time. And I just want to say thank you again to Dwayne and to Mauricio for this conversation that we've been able to have together today. For those of you who are listening or watching the podcast today, we want to just say Merry Christmas to you. We hope that in this weird Christmas that all of us are going to have, the weirdness and the differences maybe from previous Christmases will not discourage you, but that the reality of Jesus will be even more meaningful to you this Christmas. And so, and I also want to remind you as well that as we approach the end of the calendar year, this is an important time of year for donations to ministries like Impactus. And we want to encourage you and invite you to financially partner with the ministry during these days. You can just go to impactus.org, make your year-end gift to help this ministry continue to reach out, multiply their efforts to investing and equipping men for a life of purpose and godly impact. And so we want to encourage you to do that in these days. Thank you again, Dwayne and Mauricio. Good to see you guys as always. And
good to see you, Kirk.
God bless you, men. Merry Christmas. And let's pray together that 2021 is way better than 2020.
Amen.
All right. Good to see you guys. God bless you guys.
God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Impactus podcast. To learn more about living a life of purpose and godly impact, check out impactus.org.